Welcome back, everyone, to the biopathic method. And after sharing that personal testimony, we're going to start to get into a little bit more fusional type of speech regarding the esoteric and theoretic levels of understanding here. Because the esoteric, let's put it this way. When we esoterically describe the biopathic method, we can capture a more intuitive audience. Whereas when we use theoretic language, we can capture a more rational audience. And ultimately, there is an imbalance in humankind between intuitive and rational thinking. So there's a little bit of a different. Rational thinking is all about parameterizing your future based on your past. And intuitive thinking has to do with sensing the programming from future to past. And so we got past to future parameterization and future to past selection or programming, selective programming, that once we've talked about as being proto or hyper-computational and involving infinity on every level. So infinity is something that is not actually used in programming, but that's because programming is finitary and is designed as a constructive type of process. Whereas we're talking not just about constructability, but also top-down definability. Okay, so in computability theory, you've got top-down definability, bottom-up constructability or computability. And so once you pass a certain threshold of complexity, which is actually pretty low, you get undecidability, uncomputability, incompleteness, and even undefinability, etc. And that's the threshold beyond which mathematics becomes non-mechanical, meaning a finite step algorithmic procedure cannot basically complete or compute that function, that number, that process, whatever you like. And in fact, the classical theory of mathematics is itself uncomputable and incomplete, right? In fact, its lower levels are incomplete. So nature is computable, meaning completable, and incomplete, meaning uncomputable. And it's the uncomputable aspect of nature that we're having a hard time wrapping our minds around. And mapping uncomputability into computability is something that cannot be done mechanically because mechanisms fail beyond that threshold. And we're not going to get into the technical details of that yet, but they are relevant. Now, when we start talking about uncomputability, undecidability, incompleteness, undefinability, anything that is non-mechanizable, we start to get hints of what is only intuitively understood thus far among humans. So, for example, knowledge which is either beyond the veil or something that is too many variables. For example, we don't have a mathematical theory of biology because there are not only too many variables, but the processes are a strange mixture of stochastic and deterministic variables here. And the variables, furthermore, are autonomous or agentic, which, for example, biomolecules are interacting with each other agentically as our cells, as our organs, as our organ systems. And it seems like you can have higher order control of lower order components, and yet the lower order components can feed back on the higher order components. For example, you have a cell that regulates a mitotic cycle of cell division, but the internal biomolecules can also inhibit or catalyze that process, which means that there is a top-down, bottom-up type of feedback, feed-forward that is very poorly understood. And it has to do with the fact that we're still trying to isolate everything in biology. We individuate, and we try to replicate processes, overlooking the uniqueness of each step of the process and of each iteration of an identical process, right? Every single iteration of mitosis, every single iteration of, histogenesis, organogenesis, physiogenesis is itself unique. And so it's not something that can be perfectly replicated. And when we, notice random mutations or malfunctions in the replication, we say, well, that nothing is perfect, nature isn't perfect, the human body isn't perfect, but we lack an embedding metaphysical theory in which to actually interpret random mutations and malfunctions as metaphysical catalysts. See, and we're ping-ponging a little bit here, but that's the nature of fusional prose or speech. When we are discussing contropathy or allopathy, right? Contropathy being the control dependent type of treatment and curing. we're discussing variables that are supposed to be controlled. And overall, an illness is supposed to be controlled. An illness or injury has no intrinsic catalytic function. I mean, there are certain life, like let's say you break your leg, oh, you got to be more careful. That's the extent to which we talk about catalysis when it comes to injuries, right? Be more careful, be more mindful, which is actually non-trivial, first of all. And when it comes to illnesses, we basically only talk about lifestyle, right? And again, non-trivial, but is insufficient. It's necessary, but insufficient, just as parameters are necessary, but insufficient to govern proto-computational programming involving, once again, infinity at each and every step. And infinity cannot be mechanized, which is why we have uncomputable, undecidable, and incomplete aspects of mathematics. Now, the naturopathy or naturopathic aspect of treatment and healing has to do with preventing, and it focuses more on these intangible lifestyle aspects and basically says that if you live wisely, then you will minimize physical distortion and mental distortion, which is correct. But once again, what is the purpose of minimizing such distortions? Is it just for comfort? Is it just for pleasure, delight? Is it just to ease our life? Or is it to catalyze greater, deeper, denser, fuller modes of service? Where service is actually the physical, mental, and spiritual union of what we would call fulfillment. Okay, so what's the meaning of life? Okay, it's fulfillment through service to others or service to self. Now, of course, service to others equals service to self on a certain stratum, on a limit level stratum, because, the universe is one being, right? Everything has to regress to unity. You can't talk about, well, there's existence over here and there's existence over there, and there can't be some automorphism between those two existences. Well, you're calling them both existence and they're both there. Their existence is truth valuable. So there is some kind of automorphism, right? We can't talk about existences or realities that are totally separate from each other. And that's a very easy way to prove to yourself that unity is the ultimate truth. It's the absolute truth, right? It's equivalent to, it's the ontological aspect of truth valuation. Okay, you value a sentence, statement, state, etc. as true. You are basically valuing that statement as existing. The existence of that state, statement, object, system, space, whatever, is true. Okay, and if you identify truth and existence on each other, then you have a coupling of epistemology and ontology. And that is very valuable, pun intended, because ultimately then you could start to equate logical values with teleology or teleological value, which means that you can start defining utility and truth on each other. And we no longer can think of the universe as a random or mechanical or randomized / mechanized monstrosity, right? Which has certain mechanical laws, but then below a certain level or above a certain level, or with respect to dynamics, it is non-mechanical or random. Okay, non-mechanical does not mean random. All right. Now, these two methods, right, naturopathy and allopathy or contropathy, have to be conjoined. We've discussed this. There's a certain there's certain sub-method of the syntactic method called the biopathic method. And as we'll gradually approach, we have to devote a separate series to the syntactic method because we do have to get a little technical, but suffice it to say for now that the syntactic method is what allows for axioms and theorems to be coupled in such a way that they get refined and enhanced. So axioms become provable within a metaphysical system, within a closed metaphysical system, and theorems become adjoinable to physical reality, such that the states of physical reality are true statements. For example, every single state in a mitotic cycle is a true statement with respect to the non-terminal domain of such a cycle, which means with respect to the teleological aspect of such a cycle, right? Where the teleological aspect we've talked about is actually a teleodynamic or dynamical aspect, and the mechanical aspect is actually an executive sub-operation of that teleodynamism, if you like. And that means that we're talking about coupling mechanisms, parameterized mechanisms, and programmed dynamisms. And once again, the dynamisms are not programmed at random, right? So the entirety of probability theory has to get updated, right? We've got random variables and random variable distributions and random functions, and all of this is basically misnamed. And it also is hampered to what we call linear ectomorphism, where mathematical elements, relations, and operations are not defined internal to or endomorphic to their axioms. And in fact, theorems are not defined internal to the axioms because we don't have self-dual meta-axioms that can close on each other, forming a metaphysical system. We've discussed this elsewhere on the channel. This is not going to be justified herein. So if you haven't heard about this closed metaphysical system, which allows internal open-endedness or incompleteness, which can be described as comprehensiveness when we, conjoin completeness and incompleteness, then you're going to have to check out other parts of the channel. But anyway, what we can now start to describe, or approach at least, we can broach a kind of metaphysically formalized version of the chakra system. And as well as we can start discussing different levels of syntax of humans. So we've talked about the space-time object syntax as being a kind of physical syntax in which physical mechanisms can be actually understood as functions or operations more accurately. And these would include beginning with every single physical operation that is attributed to nature, regardless of scale, right? So we're talking from astrophysics all the way to quantum physics. And all of these, we can say, physical operations are endemic, native to physical syntax. Now, of course, we should notice that even though the states that are being taken as inputs and being outputted are physical, the actual functions are mathematical or computational, right? And, ultimately we do define our physical theories on computability or constructability, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to achieve the finiteness that we need to bound any given system or variable or process, which is what defines physics as finitude, right? And there's nothing wrong with that, actually. But we need to, at the outset, we need to understand that this is a hallmark of physics. And when we start getting into mathematical syntax, we start considering the extended set of elements, relations, and operations that include physical operations, but are not limited thereto, that include physical states as elements, but are not limited thereto, but nevertheless imbue those operations and elements and even the relations between elements and operations as with abstract structure, with abstraction, meaning there's an abstract domain, which we've been calling the non-terminal domain, but it is far from static. It's teleodynamic. Okay, it's utility driven, but the utility is defined on the limit level syntax of the system. And this limit level syntax can only be approached and approximated by localized subsystems such as humans. Okay, we can refer to ourselves as endomorphic images of this metaphysical system, but we cannot exhaust the metaphysical system, and we cannot actually establish a bijection between ourselves and the metaphysical system in the same way that the system can to us. Okay, the system, which we call existence, very roughly speaking, but it's actually a metaformal system. It goes beyond formalism and dynamism. And again, this is discussed elsewhere on the channel, so this is frustrating because, I don't know what all these terms mean. You're going to have to watch other presentations, sorry. But anyway, ultimately, we have physical syntax, which gives way more general. It's the most specific type of syntax that a human can recognize, again, consisting of physical elements, physical relations, and physical operations, which are imbued with abstraction or non-physicality when we start identifying them as a subset of logical mathematical syntax, which includes operations that we can't yet, or even in principle is tricky because technically you can map all existing mathematical theories into human minds, where a mind is actually the composite non-terminal aspect of the physical material terminus known as the brain and central nervous system. But anyway, we can attribute, it's not precisely correct to say that that mathematical theories are completely independent of anything physical, because you do need physical transducers, which, again, on a certain very high level stratum, we can call brains. But anyway, let's stabilize here. You've got, from specificity to generality, you have physical syntax, you've got mathematical syntax, and then we start to get into things that are irreducible to quantitative operations and quantitative elements and relations. And this is perceptual syntax. We've been calling this the qualio-perceptual syntax, or QPS. So you've got the STOS, space-time object subsyntax, the LMS, logical mathematical subsyntax, which both of those respectively are propositional and predicate level types of syntax, handling definitions and descriptions respectively. And then you have interpretations, which require perceptions, where objects become percepts, relations become perceptual mappings, and operations become perceptions proper, or perceptual operators. And this is where we start getting into the hard problem of consciousness, because once you get a certain level of complexity, the system becomes a subsystem. A localized subsystem becomes self-conscious, and the self-consciousness can't reduce its own percepts to any quantitative language, which is what we want to do when we start talking about, how can we reduce perceptions to physical processes. You can't, right? Perceptions are transduced and instantiated by physical processes, but it's a category error to conflate a perceptual process and a physical process. They're happening on two different strata of syntax. Okay, and those strata of syntax are united by a property called self-duality, which is a property that, again, we've talked about in mathematics. It's a mathematical property, but in mathematics, it's a unique or ultra special case of a duality, which is itself a special case of symmetry, which is itself a special case of asymmetry, etc. Whereas in mathematical metaphysics, we have to start talking about self-duality as not just a unique property, but a systemic property, meaning you have self-dual meta-axioms that double as meta-theorems, and they close two different domains. The meta-axioms close a non-terminal domain, coupling it with a terminal domain defined by the meta-theorems. Again, this is some complexity that we've defined elsewhere, but so you'll just have to take it for now, right? And again, that's going to frustrate rational thinkers, and it might excite intuitive thinkers, and that's basically what we're just going to have to accept for now. But once you have perceptual syntax in which everything is qualitative and you cannot reduce things to quantities, you could start defining quantities in terms of qualities, and those quantities, whether mathematical or physical, would regress to and be programmed by QPS. But of course, QPS is not self-sufficient, because QPS doesn't motivate itself. When we start asking questions like, why does existence exist? Well, there has to be some kind of fundamental motivation. And the fundamental motivation for a system to bring itself into existence, to self-generate and self-select at once, according to the unique or self-dual form or self-start symbol that can give rise to any finitary structure, is what we would call the emotional syntax, because motivation is ultimately emotional. Teleology is ultimately emotional. Now, not just limited human emotions that are transduced by neurotransmitters, neuromodulators, hormones, etc., and their broader embedding systems. These types of emotions are far, far beyond what we would call human emotions, but we can recognize analogs. We can recognize localized analogs of universal emotions. Okay, and the generative emotion, which we would associate with the self-generation of existence, we can call love. But of course, there are sub-emotions defined in terms of love, which distort love for a catalytic purpose, and which celebrate love in a sense we could say a celebratory purpose. Okay, this is where we start getting into what metaphysical catalysis is. Every biopathy begins with the top level syntax being emotional syntax, and the bottom level syntax, the base level syntax being physical syntax, and begins understanding, we can say, symptomologies where symptoms are actually physical states in terms of emotional syntax, perceptual syntax, and mathematical syntax. So basically, what we get is a kind of metaphysical catalysis, which is defined first and foremost on emotional impulses, right? We've got electrical impulses that are actually a physical analog of emotional impulses or motivations, beginning with love, beginning with what, religions and spiritual circles call love, which is the primordial or universal emotion which motivates the self-generation of existence. Okay, but that motivation has to also couple with a perception capable of interpreting it, a mathematization capable of describing it in terms of properties or predicates, and a physicalization or physical instantiation capable of defining it. So when you have a definition, you need to be able to describe the objects of definition, otherwise the definition is empty. But in order to describe the objects of definition, you need to interpret what a definition and a description are, what an element and a property are in relation to each other, which means that you need to operate on the elements to produce the definition and the description at once, as sort of dual aspects. So that's why on the perceptual level of syntax, we can start talking about the self-dualization of this definition, right? Which physical definition, mathematical description, and perceptual interpretation. So physical definition or instantiation, mathematical description, all descriptions being mathematical because they appeal to non-physical properties, okay? The mechanical aspect of LMS or mathematical syntax is what we were talking about as being computable, constructible, etc. But once we start talking about definable yet uncomputable aspects, non-mechanizable aspects, we start getting into the hard problem of consciousness, the irreducibility of emotions and perceptions, and even natural language expressions to these symbols and icons and signs that are used to, we can say, physically instantiate them, including the physical transducers, human brain, human body, etc. Then we start getting into the connection between the LMS and the QPS, right? And of course, when we start talking about physical laws and how those physical laws and physical states and physical relationships are actually non-physical, are described in terms of non-physical properties, then we start getting into the linkage or connection between the STOS, the physical syntax, and mathematical syntax. So each of these, and of course, there are finer interrelationships between STOS, LMS, QPS, and ETS, or the emotelic syntax, the emotional syntax, which we'll get into in time. But what you have to understand is that metaphysical catalysis begins, we can say, as an emotional impulse on the ETS level, on the emotional syntactic level, which motivates and coordinates and ultimately selectively programs perceptual systems to then downwardly program mathematical systems to downwardly program physical systems. And the idea behind naturopathy is to basically motivate yourself to live a lifestyle which conduces to physical health. But if you do not conduce yourself to physical health in the greater service of fulfillment of the health of others, for example, fulfillment of the enjoyment and enhancement of others, then a more sensitive practitioner of naturopathy would say that lifestyle is insufficient to produce full vitality. Okay, now there are some anomalies here. There are some subtleties that have to do with emotional syntactic impulses, which can program on an unconscious level debilitations or limiting factors that are encoded genetically and can be executed or expressed or activated epigenetically, which, in a nutshell, are designed to radiate certain catalysts to others. And this could be, for an example of this would be ALS, or motor neuron disease, motor neuron syndrome, as it's also called. Many people who get ALS, many children who get cancer, many people who are born with congenital difficulties or defects, so-called, are, for all intents and purposes, angelic personalities which radiate love, inducing compassion, inspiration, admiration, and ultimately wisdom on those with whom they come into contact. And this is near universally recorded. If you talk to any, parent who has their child at St. Jude's Hospital, they will discuss how their child is essentially angelic, and they can't explain how their child is so loving and wise and displays a type of lucidity and purity which goes beyond all words. Now, that's one anomaly slash subtlety that I'm going to plant as an Easter egg for later. But what we should understand is that programmatic causation flows from the emotional syntax down to the perceptual syntax to the mathematical syntax to the physical syntax. Now, the emotional syntax motivates the interpretation, descriptions, and definitions of every single system. Now, of course, when we start defining systems as body, mind, spirit complexes, we can identify physical syntaxes on body complexes, mathematical or logical mathematical syntax on mind complexes, and QPS, or the interpretative aspect of syntax, on spirit complexes or souls. Thereby, we have unique self-dualities between the elements, relations, and operations within each syntax, subsyntax, and we have a systemic self-dualization according to the motivation, embedding physical definitions or instantiations, mathematical descriptions, and or predications, and qualio-perceptual interpretations. So there are either unique self-dualities intrinsic to each subsyntax. Again, the self-dualities between element, relation, and operation. It's a definitional type of self-duality. You can't define a relation without elements. You can't actually define elements without relation between element and non-element or another element. And you can't define something without using the operation known as definition. Okay, so that's an example of the self-duality intrinsic to physical definitions, right? And you can't actually define anything without some kind of physical referent, because otherwise you don't have any bounding. That's why we said that finitude is actually very, very important, fundamental. It's base level syntax to have finitary elements. That's what, that when we talk about, physical syntax, we can talk about finitary elements, finitary relations, and finitary operations. Without that, you can't define something, right? That's why we had nothing in terms of which to define a mathematical object if we didn't have some kind of notation, if we didn't have some kind of abstract reference, as some kind of symbolic reference, where the symbol doesn't have any intrinsic relationship to the mathematical object, right? The little tick 2 doesn't have anything in relation, doesn't have any intrinsic connection, we say, with the actual properties of two-ness. Okay, but without that notation, how are we even conceiving? Even if we have no mental image of two, how can we conceive of two-ness? Right? So what we should start to understand is that these levels of syntax, programmatic, okay, each of these levels of syntax has parametric and programmatic aspects of causation. Physical syntax is primarily parametric, but as we know, even though someone's physical body is primarily governed in terms of motivations and then perceptions and then structural mappings or relations between perceptions and motivations on the physiological and psychological level, if some third variable, some confounding variable like a deranged human comes in and hits somebody with a bat or commits arson or whatever, then that shows that the physical syntax does have programmatic power, right? Because it can extinguish or also derange that primarily motivational and perceptual system. So this is something we have to understand, is that even though we can talk about degrees of programmability or parameterizability, right? Ultimately, the ETS and the STOS both have parametric and programmatic power. even though the ETS has much, much greater programmatic power, especially when considered in terms of N, or the non-terminal domain. Okay. Now remember, the terminal and non-terminal domains are not disjoint like 0, 1, and 2, 3 are two just disjoint sets. Okay. The non-terminal domain technically includes the terminal domain as a strict subset. And there's a little bit of, actually, that's not technically correct. You need something called topological descriptive inclusion. You need a kind of self-dual inclusion whereby whereby the set topologically includes elements and the elements descriptively or syntactically include the overall set as a property. So the set includes elements as objects. The objects include the set as a property or as a relation. Okay. And therefore, we can also identify STOS, mainly physical syntax, LMS, mathematical syntax, and QPS, or perceptual syntax, in terms of elements, relations, and operations. The definitions are element-oriented. Descriptions or predications are relation-oriented because, literally descriptions are relations between elements or objects. And finally, interpretations are operation-oriented because in order to actually understand or model theoretically interpret elements and relations, you need to you need to apply the operation of interpretation, description, and definition together. So you also have the systemic self-duality that ETS, that the emotelic or emotional syntax effects, is that of the physical definitions or physical elementalizations, mathematical structuralizations, and we can say QPS or perceptual operationalizations. Okay, so again, unique self-duality intrinsic to each syntax, binding the elements, relations, and operations definitionally internal to each syntax, intrinsic to each syntax. And then you have a systemic self-duality, which is captured by the ETSs. In other words, the ETS's elements are the entire STOS is actually the ETS's elementalization. Right. And these are relatively inscrutable statements, but again, we're planting them as Easter eggs. And I don't have a lot of time here. I actually got to close the video soon, unfortunately. But hopefully this will help us to understand how the naturopathic idea of just sheer prevention for the purpose of comfort and pleasure and longevity is insufficient, as is the contrapathic insistence on elimination of random or mechanical malfunctions, invasions, accumulations. But anyway, the ETS, its elements are the entire subsyntax of physics, where physics is actually extended to chemistry and biology as they stand. These are physically confined theories. We have reductionism in effect, etc. Anyway, these theories are confined to parametric causation. The programmatic aspect of all these entities, except perhaps in biology, is overlooked only when we start getting into living systems, biological life forms, as we call them, because, biological life forms are actually just one class of life form. Anyway, this is something that we talk about in the meta-technology series. That's only then can we really start talking about higher order control, and therefore a little bit of programmatic causation, a feedback on parametric causation. But in the end, you have ETS containing self-dualizing STOS as elementalization as its elements, LMS as its relations or structures, and QPS as its operations. So yes, you can perceive emotions, okay? You can structure emotions, and you can define emotions, but you need entire subsyntaxes to do that. And so the ETS is the limit level syntax, okay? Which we can identify with the teleodynamization of every single incarnation-discarnation cycle, where incarnations are actually the executive sequences of these subsyntaxes, and discarnations are the distributive potentializations of these subsyntaxes. Okay, because once again, every single element, every single relation, every single operation intrinsic to physical, mathematical, perceptual, and ultimately emotional syntax is terminal and non-terminal. Okay, so there's also a self-duality between terminal and non-terminal domains, as we discussed. Okay, terminal elements instantiate non-terminals or grammatical non-terminals, but the grammatical non-terminals program their own instances. And the feedback between programming and product or instance is what we've been talking about as telons, the currency, the units of proto-computation, because they're axiom theorem, they're property product couplings where axioms are properties and products are are theorems, are adjoint theorems, right? States are statements, true statements. And therefore, in order to actually program and instantiate telons, you need something called telic recursion, which is the teleodynamical self-selection of any particular ETS, where the ETS is not just a syntactic module, but is actually the overall system. We can identify every single body-mind-spirit complex as an ETS when acting as an irreducible unit or self-dual quantum, where a quantum is actually not referring to quantum mechanics, but is referring to an irreducible unit. The unit is not just singular, it is self-dual. Okay, predicates can characterize elements and operations. Elements can characterize properties or predicates and operations can characterize elements and predicates. Every single element, every single relation, every single operation can contain its elemental, relational, and operational componentry. This is self-dualization of the ETS. So you think of self-dualization as being the structural term for teleodynamization, which is the ontological term, which is the phenomenological term, in fact. So that's all the time I have for now. Hopefully you've enjoyed. We've previewed what metaphysical catalysis is. It's ETS-driven programming of telons that flow from motivations down to perceptions, down to mathematizations or structuralizations, down to instantiations, and symptomologies are purely instantiations. Symbologies are when you start when you start linking, creating mappings between complex symptoms and their reference, their motivating reference, their emotional impulses. They're designed to aid you in crystallizing your overall incarnation discarnation cycle in terms of ETS attributes or the predicates of ETS telons, which we sometimes call ETS telons for short. All right. Well, thank you so much for listening and have a beautiful day, everyone.